Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in about 1 to 2 minutes, letting everyone flood in from the previous session. But while you wait, please drop in the chat box some of your highlights so far from the ALE conference, yesterday's keynote, today's brunch, or a previous panel you've attended. Share with our panelists what you've been enjoying. We'll start in 1 more minute, but while you wait, please give us a recap of some of the highlights of this weekend's events in the chat box for us. All right, good afternoon. We're going to get this panel started. I personally, as a dual degree student in business and public policy, am very ecstatic about this panel. I'm a firm believer that business can't save the world and can't solve all the world's solutions. And so it's very important for us to lend an ear across different sectors. So I hope that you walk away from this panel understanding what disenfranchisement has looked like in the Black community for over years and what are our next steps to make sure that the harms of the past don't continue to affect us, but also what are some things that you can do and the business community can do to further champion policy beyond just an election year. So before we get started, I would love for our panelists to give just a quick intro so our audience members can know where you're coming from, where you're joining us from, and also a little bit about your background. And so we can start with Adrian, Caleb, and Iffy.
Great. Well, thanks so much to Tim, and thanks everyone for joining us on a Saturday. It's great to see everybody in here. I'm Professor Adrian Harris. I'm a professor of the practice at the Ford School at the University of Michigan. Also an angel investor, mostly in fintech. I started my career as a lawyer in New York, then went to the Obama Treasury Department, and then served in the Obama White House as a special assistant to the president, managing the financial services and housing finance portfolios. Then went and started and grew a successful fintech in San Francisco before joining the university. So I'm really excited about our discussion today.
Good to see everyone. My name is Caleb Gale. I'm based in Harlem, where I'm coming from today, or at least broadcasting from today, if you will. Spent the majority of my life primarily in public and social sectors, working for the Mexican government as an economic policy advisor, and also working as a program officer in charge of strategy and operations for the George Kaiser Family Foundation, as well as a short stint in consulting at Boston Consulting Group, as many of you are doomed, or rather fortunate to get to experience at some point or another. But all throughout, I do a lot of writing for the New York Times Magazine, New York Times, The Atlantic, so on and so forth. And I'm a fellow at the New America Foundation, where I write primarily about race and identity in America, specifically its history and how it manifests itself today.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Iffy Ike. I am a researcher and attorney by training. I am a disruptor for fun. And I am the founder of a data-centered, data-informed, people-centered social impact firm called Pink Cornrows, but also have been a founder of several other startups focused on prioritizing equity through a data lens. I'm seeing all the rave reviews that people had of Angela Rye. I have worked with her on the Hill, former Hill staffer, worked on the House Judiciary, as well as for specifically for the office of Congressman Donald M. Payne Sr., and have also been on the ground in places like Ferguson, Baltimore, and eventually worked at the mayor's office in New York City, while also being the big sister to Erica Garner. So I'm here to definitely discuss how we make movement transformational in spaces and institutions that were never built and designed for us. And hopefully we can talk about what it looks like moving forward with the both continued but also newly shaped America that we're in. So thank you all for having me.
Well, let's not waste any time. This is going to be a phenomenal panel. We'll start more at a macro level and focus on disenfranchisement of the Black community. The first two questions will be for all of our panelists. So starting first, it's no secret that there are several policies that overtly disenfranchise Black and Brown communities. What do you believe is the most blatant policy today that hurts our communities? And we'll start with Caleb, Iffy, then Adrian.
Sure. So, I mean, I think that it's really hard to pick a policy, and I think even more so, I think all of us probably have our policy interests, and so as such, we're going to over-index on selecting the policy area that we're most familiar with. And so I think that the most blatant policy today is more so the most blatant kind of disregard for accepting an all-inclusive set of strategies that might be beneficial for those who are Black and who have a legacy of being Black here in the United States. So what I mean by that is I don't think that there are targeted universal programs that are designed specifically to help people with a legacy of being owed something by this country through the form of reparations and restitution that quite frankly disadvantage folks like us who are Black for quite some time. There's no coherent and comprehensive strategy. You saw that a little bit of emergent strategies with people, Pete Buttigieg, who talked about like a Marshall Plan for civil rights in America, something marshaled a series of sources of opportunity for people of color. So I don't know if there's a policy specifically that is most blatantly hurting Black and Brown folks, but I think it's a suite of policies that be generated by an acceptance that we need to marshal a variety of sources, all resources available, and deploy them in a targeted yet universal way to people of color in America who are in fact owed restitution reparations.
Yeah, I agree. When I saw this question, and even when we talked about it, I was like, we have an hour. Okay, so I will say that, but I did want to reflect on kind of like both how I entered into this space with my understanding of what are the policies that are still impacting us, even when it's not just limited to the letter of the law, or not limited to just one legislation or one policy. And so I want to kind of start with this kind of like framework. Forgive me, y'all, I'm Nigerian, so sometimes we just enter stuff with stories. But I start with this piece that I found, and it says, "Runaway on Friday 26th of 1774 from Westchester County, province of New York. A Negro man named Will, about 27 years old, about 5 feet 6 inches, somewhat of a yellow complexion, spry, lively fellow, very talkative. And then I want to fast forward to last week in Rochester in response to a family calling officers for what would have required for more of a social worker or a counselor, an officer seizing and handcuffing a 9-year-old Black girl. And as she began to scream and state that she was hurt, the officers said to her, "You're acting like a child." And she screamed back, "I am a child." And even in that position, she was pepper sprayed directly in her eyes. And the police chief afterwards even said that not only did it work, but that it could have been worse. So while we are in a space where we have great backgrounds, great degrees, great credentials, I think there are many concepts that we will raise today, but I want us to recognize that as long as there have been Black people in this country, there has also been the policing of Black bodies in this country. And that policing is a concept that sells to us that police are keeping us safe when we know that police in itself don't prevent crimes. And with the recent actions that we saw on January 6th, which also happens to be my sister's birthday, we also have been able to see the hypocritical nature of how policing actually applies to our bodies. I also want to highlight for those of us that are even thinking about how we enter into our workspaces, a lot of the work that Pink Cornrows does is about creating safe spaces in employment. And what we recognize is that the surveilling of Black bodies is not just about what happens with law enforcement, that even as Trayvon would have been 26 years old this week, we forget that George Zimmerman was not a police officer, but he was empowered by the laws and the practice of policing in this country that he could act like one. And so I want us to really think about what safety really looks like when, as long as we've been here, there has never been a space where Black people could even just make a mistake and that it would have a different response. And that we should also recognize that the concept of policing and surveilling our actions in our bodies have resulted in a school or prison pipeline. But even when we are in school or in our workspaces, that there still is an expectation of how we respond to rules and regulations, largely because we don't want to get in trouble. So I want us to think about that as we think of all the other policies that stem from that oftentimes we are merely just trying to exist without somebody saying you're going to be harmed or hurt, or that you're going to be excluded from community and society.
So I'll add, I think it is very hard to isolate things because so many of the policies that impact the Black and Brown communities are interrelated, right? It's hard to disentangle criminal justice and law enforcement from education, from wealth building, right? All of these things. And so it is very hard to pick a challenging thing. I think, you use the word blatant, Jatem, and I think, to Iffy's point, criminal justice and law enforcement is probably the most blatant, right? It's the most in your face, whereas this other stuff that we talk about is obvious, right? But it's so enmeshed and entangled with our society that it doesn't seem as blatant. And I think it allows for a lot of policymakers to approach it with a race blind or race neutral lens in the best case, right? As opposed to, I think, as Caleb was alluding to, right, taking race into account and taking affirmative action to fix some of the injustices we see in the policy world.
Thank you all. Those were very comprehensive, and I would just say ditto. Moving on to that same vein, we see so many different things plaguing the Black community, but we have a new administration, and we know that this administration may not be the best, but I think I would rather have this administration as my enemy to be able to have conversations with and hopefully create solutions with rather than the previous one. So let's get in our problem-solving mode. Where do you see the most significant opportunity to improve social and economic outcomes for Black and Brown communities, and why do you believe that? And so we'll start with Iffy, Adrian, then Caleb.
I love this moderating style, by the way. I'm going to adopt this the next time I do this, because this is better than jumping in and being the loudest, because I don't win with those. But I will say that there are three things that I think we can think about from a problem-solving mode. The first is continuing to call out the failure of the COVID relief strategy, because I do think that there are more people in the conversation about what wasn't working before and how now there are more players trying to use this one epidemic, very large epidemic, as a way and a test on how we address racial disparities and the engagement with our community from a culturally responsive lens. So that is actually overdue, but it is a positive move that was necessary. The second is providing true economic relief for the cancellation of student debt, even if it's up to $50,000, which for the first time, we're seeing people that are considered on the far, far, far left with people that are considered more institutional moderates, such as Senator Chuck Schumer. But what that means, especially for those of us with graduate degrees, and especially for those that have intersectional living, and especially Black women, is a real shift in what is possible and what we can actually own and build off of moving forward. And then the third is really connected to what I had raised earlier, which helps us to think about who should rightfully be in leadership, not just in police, but in elected spaces. And so I've been following a lot the legislation around the eradication of white supremacy, whether it's in policing or in elected positions, such as the bills that Representative Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush have pushed forward. I would say in the intermediary though, and this kind of gets to what Adrian was speaking to, that job creation is going to be really crucial. So I do think that we should really be looking at some of these economic packages, regardless of how you feel about the new Green Deal. It's really important that we look at the job creation section there, because there's a lot of opportunity for us to really talk about what equitable job creation would look like. And then finally, when it comes to emerging areas like cannabis, but also green energy, we need to make sure on a statewide level, Michigan included, that we are advocating to make sure that we don't have to reach these high thresholds that would almost make it impossible for us to be able to participate in that industry, one that's already becoming divided on race lines.
Yeah, I'm just gonna pick up on this economic empowerment message, Iffy, because I think we're at such a unique point in our history, given the events, given the past 4 years, the events of last summer, now where we are with COVID, and there really is this recognition about the disparities, right? That us as Black people and brown people have known for a long time, right? But that we've struggled to get even white allies to recognize, right? And they are starting to do that. So seizing on this moment and making sure that economic empowerment is really something that trickles through to our communities. And this goes back to this point of not just having race blind policies, right? But very race aware policies. And you see this in the vaccine debate. Should Black and brown communities be prioritized, right? Not just distributed with vaccines equally, but prioritized. That's a conversation you never would have heard. I mean, certainly not during the last 4 years, but over the last couple of decades, right? You would not have heard that sort of awareness. So I think it's really incumbent upon all of us to seize on this opportunity and to push those policies even further. And you've seen even last year, the Federal Reserve is revising its mandate around full employment, right? To take into account Black and brown unemployment. The Fed is a very conservative, lowercase c, right? Slow moving institution. The fact that they came out and said, we realize we have to adjust our policies because we cannot address the full economic health of this country without taking into account Black and brown unemployment, is, as small as it seems, right, is pretty earth-shattering, right, for that sort of an institution to make that sort of statement. So there's a real opportunity here, I think, to push on the economic empowerment front. And so many things can come from that economic empowerment, right? So that really is sort of a foundational question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, want to echo all of that, but I think that one thing that I think we're in danger of in the United States is that our democracy has gotten weaker, right? The functioning of our democracy has become weaker with 2013 and the rollback of a lot of the pre-clearance requirements for the Voting Rights Act, to the incursions of things like prison gerrymandering, which have been around for a very long time, to gerrymandering that, especially given that there are 15 gubernatorial seats that are held by Democrats, and state legislatures are going to craft what the lines are, where they are, the ability of those who are formerly incarcerated to re-engage. So for me, the health of our democracy is really at stake. And we saw and have seen iterations of that over and over and over again. And I think, to me, the most prescient, opportunity is both Senate Bill 1 and HR 1, right? In the 117th Congress, this Congress, the For the People Act, right? I think if democracy is not well, a lot of the things that we want to do, we just won't sustainably do within the institutional frameworks that we have. And so, to me, where I see probably the greatest opportunity to create sort of foundational framework-driven opportunity for Black and Brown lives, it's if Black and Brown lives and their ability to cast the ballot, their ability to engage at the state and local and federal level is no longer upended by its special interests, by interests that are not particularly aligned with a greater and more significant turnout of Black and Brown folks. So to me, like, the Congress, both last time in the last Congress, tried, the House of Representatives, that was their first bill sponsored by Congressman Sarbanes, and Mitch McConnell said, I'm uninterested in ever bringing this to the floor, and he never did. But now that we actually have this opportunity, and not just the opportunity, but we have the opportunity to expand what is possible, we have the opportunity to literally do what hopefully our founders probably didn't want us to do. We have the opportunity to expand the franchise by leaps and bounds, right? And I think that is abundantly both clear, and we have a green light control of all elements of the legislative and the executive to actually make that happen. So for me, I am intensely focused on hoping the For the People Act gets passed by this Congress.
I could talk about voter disenfranchisement, suppression, gerrymandering for the rest of this panel, but we're going to pivot and focus on the intersection of policy and business. Adrian, Caleb, I know that you all both have gone to business schools, and so I wanted to ask this first question to you all. Business school is one of the many environments that is known to produce leaders in the workplace. How can business students, alumni, faculty, and other professionals leverage their resources to exercise their political power and become active leaders in their community, aside from voting every 4 years in the presidential election? And so we'll start with Adrian and Caleb.
Sure. Well, I think it's a good question for this audience and for this panel. There's a lot of degrees on this panel, for sure. I know Caleb has a number of advanced degrees. If he does, I have a JD and MBA as well. But I will say it does not take a fancy degree from a fancy school to be a leader and to be civically engaged, right? That does not make it easier. And in some ways it makes it harder because you have a tendency to want to engage in fancy ways, right? Rather than getting your hands dirty often. So first, I want to say you shouldn't be voting every 4 years. It should really be every 2. And sometimes every year, right? If you have an off-cycle gubernatorial race, so land in odd years, or municipal race. So you might find yourself voting every year. And if you have the ability to do that, you should. Second, I'm going to make myself out to be sort of like the old grandma on the panel. Tweeting, Instagram, all of that to make your voice heard is great, but it's very comfortable, right? To be able to sit in your living room and tweet and feel like you did something. You did do something, but there's definitely more you can do, right? You should be out in the community volunteering, whether it's through an organization or just informally, right? You should be frequenting Black businesses. You should be, right? You should be writing letters and starting petitions to elected officials. You should be starting petitions, right? There's just an endless number of ways to get engaged. But I do find that sort of, unfortunately, the more education people have, the more averse they are to really getting down in the muck and rolling up their sleeves and being on the ground, as if he said. So whatever your way of engaging is and being a leader, it really starts from that groundwork, right? From being engaged in the communities that you're trying to help, and not just, sitting on your couch, only leveraging social media to try and make your voice heard.
Agreed. Yeah, I think my best way of saying this is I'm a little bit more recent out of business school, and so speaking directly to those who are in business school now or what have you. You got a phenomenal institution that's highly ranked, and there's going to be really great opportunities that are going to fly at you kind of continuously. and you get to benefit from the fact that wherever the safety net was for you is kind of ascends as you escalate in your career. But I think that if there are any of you who have this desire to become engaged directly in the process by dedicating the full measure of your career to helping those on the margins, then I would say, such that your financial life allows you to, don't wait, right? There is a need to do so now. And I think, especially where I went to business school at HBS, there's this assumption that I will eventually, after many years of working in consulting or banking and then private equity, so on and so forth, where oftentimes I'm spending most of my time like leveraging the tools of capitalism to advance myself while actively not focusing on helping anyone on the margins, oftentimes are, the sad victims of the work that I do, right? Why not get engaged with the desires that you might have to help those on the margins now? And I'm not saying that is a need to, but if you have that urge, right, the best way you can be a leader now is by doing it right now, right? There is actually the fierce urgency of now. The other thing that I would say is, yes, you should be voting as often as it is legally allowed for you to vote, right? If you are in Virginia, right now you should be preparing to vote for governor and lieutenant governor and a host of other things, right? But I also think that making sure that you within your company are just assuming that you go into the private sector, that you are a willing partner or a willing aggravator to ensure that your company is wresting control of its desire to kind of maximize returns at the expense of people at times, right? And so I think, being sometimes a squeaky wheel can be a precarious affair, especially for those of us who don't come from wealth or who don't come from extreme levels of privilege. But there is a reason, as I think has been talked about during this conference, that you might be at the table. And it's not just to expand the table, but it might be also thinking about why is there a table to begin with, right? So my perspective, as you tell, I'm probably pretty far to the left on these questions, but as a person with all of this privilege and quote unquote business knowledge, I think it's incumbent upon you to identify that the fierce urgency of now should beckon you to become engaged now and not later if you can. And also, you should be a squeaky wheel that either it's attended to or forces the change that needs to be done, because that's, again, now, not later.
I mean, you all are taking me to church. I feel like I'm about to scream out amen. But moving on, the next question is for Iffy and Caleb. In the past, Black leaders have had limited set of stakeholders and issues to appease. When we're thinking about accountability, which has been a really big thing since May 25th of last summer, and for us, majority of our lives, describe how accountability for leadership in the workplace has changed with these recent events. And so we're thinking about Black Lives Matter, Me Too, all of the Black images on social media last summer that maybe didn't follow up with any particular action. How are we going to hold our leaders in our workplaces accountable if they've made promises or if they haven't?
I can go ahead and start. So as I mentioned, our team was a former founder, and it's still running, of a firm called Think Rubik's. And in that space, we were building out our equity response, mostly to larger institutions, government, and in the workspace. And what we realized is I do not hold myself as a D&I professional, although at times I'm sure we all are called in to do and respond to that work. I hold ourselves, I proudly say that we are an equity firm because there is a difference, right? And I do see D&I as tools at times towards achieving equity, but D&I by themselves are not equity. And so what we are finding is that to the extent, as Caleb mentioned, because I do think there are some people probably called to do some of the disruption and agitation work more overtly, and then there are those that can be a little bit more silent about it internally. We are often called in to help provide an equity lens and to really explain to people why that's a little bit different. It does require a macro understanding outside of your title or your job as to the state of especially Black people, Black and Brown people, individual Indigenous communities in the workspace, and what the challenges are for us that are completely different than our counterparts. And where we have found that has been helpful is, especially for many of us, whether for me it started in Wall Street for a very short period of time before I started doing human and civil rights law, that you are outnumbered, right? People are going to claim that they're going to come in and they're going to look to you like you're the expert on all things, Black people. Tell us how you feel. Tell us, what are you all doing? Anything I can help. And we want to be clear that, number one, that labor is still an extension of trauma, right? Oftentimes put on us to respond and fix and lead in the workspace. But also, number two, a lot of the issues that I have around mainstream D&I spaces, which often are the ones that take on the burden of responding to these social issues, is they still focus on how we improve the lens and the language of people in the majority, than creating safe spaces for people that are an extension of those communities and still have to go home, if not their own home, but connected to the people in their daily lives that they're literally afraid of, are they gonna make it or not? So Pink Cornrows, literally with the formation of our name and everything else, we are very intentional, like literally bias happens. So if you hear a firm called Pink Cornrows, you already know what's going down. So that's just number one. And number two, we believe that our response to data and our response to, if I believe that we have been left out of the table today, that means we've been left out of the table in several spaces of analysis, right? So we literally help companies and firms look at everything from not even just who's in the industry, but what are your recruitment tactics? Who are you recruiting with? When you say there's a pipeline issue, like really tease that out a little bit. And really challenging them on how they source their workspaces. And then finally, while I do believe, and we do have clients where they do have large global responses that have really deep social impact for communities that are involved, the reason why we actually entered into this whole like workspace thing is that we don't talk enough about what unequal pay means to the aggregate of Black communities, right? When you have almost 70% of Black people who are raised in what people call single parent homes, and what that also means compounded with the way the legal system impacts our lives, close to 40% of Latino communities that are also in that same situation, then all of us, not just Black women, all of us need to be invested in advocating for Black women to get their dollar, right? Because of how we drive economy, because of the ways we show up in economy, but also because of the social strain that we have that is unlike any other demographic, including our Black male counterparts. And also want to add that there is data to show that yes, Black men have a completely different profiling issue as it relates to actually getting into some of these corporate spaces. And what we see is that when they are in these corporate spaces, there's a different existence between Black women and Black men, often on the lines of promotion, often on the times of acknowledgement of their work. So we also provide space because we don't think this is a space where we should be fighting with each other, but one of a space of strategy and how do we advocate together collectively. And I don't want to use binary terms, like just as a people, non-gender conforming people, queer folk, how do we actually say, I see you and I also see who's missing. And I'm actually not here to have my labor used unless we're going to actually strategize and create a different environment. So I put that out there largely because to what Caleb was saying around, we go in these corporate spaces, and I used to think that was going to be the case. I purposely went to a public interest law school. So I was like, all right, if I do get a good job, I'm going to stay there for about 5 years, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to do ... you don't go into any place without getting a little bit influenced by the spaces that you're in, right? Good, bad, or indifferent. And sometimes the way we see impact is shaped by these spaces and these industries that we're in that pose social conflicts, internal conflicts. So regardless of the space that you go into, I really, really encourage people to be a part of the conversation if you feel like your contribution can have a deeper impact beyond you, right? Because you're going to get your check and you're going to be okay. And you can devise your own personal individual plan of what success looks like. But the problem with the American dream for people that come from African communities is that it doesn't allow us to think about the collectivism as an active practice. So we do have to find different ways of finding greater disruptive opportunities, especially when we're talking about places that have economic and capital realities that touch our communities. So that's a different shift than maybe just doing a statement or maybe just doing a hashtag, as Adrian said. We can be that driver, but I also want to caution that you shouldn't have to be the only one, right? That there should be a way where we are not the ones that are always doing the labor, that we have to really invest in how the decision makers see us as valuable and also aren't afraid of just one or two being here, but what does it look like for us to be here in critical mass?
Yeah, I think that's what I would say in responses. Yeah, I think one thing that Ifioma said that I think is useful is questions of collectivism and questions also of, you know, whether or not we're trying to improve the gaze of those in power, or if we're trying to make those spaces more habitable and accommodating to folks of all different backgrounds, right? Which then forces a conversation more toward equity and not sometimes the kind of the margins that we usually isolate diversity and inclusion conversations to, right? So I think that's like a particularly important point I just wanted to elevate and amplify. Another thing I would say is that, like, when you look at like the history of companies, right? And I want to say this very carefully, like we look at the history of the automotive industry, like one thing that like I remember distinctively is that, you know, places like Ford and others, GM, would kind of laud themselves about, you know, having a lot of, you know, non-white folks on the assembly lines long before the Civil Rights Act or anything else like that, the Open Housing Act, Voting Rights Act, any of those things were passed. And I sat back and thought to myself, well, Ford shouldn't be lauding themselves. Walter Reuther, right? And the power of collective unions who said, no, we're going to advance the ball far faster than these businesses will. I think the main thing that I want to say, and maybe it's because I'm a jaded person or just more cynical than the average person, it's because I love history and I love writing and I do a lot of journalism, is that like I don't really like it that much when businesses decide to like issue some Black Lives Matter stance, because their actions really don't tell me that Black Lives Matter at all, right? There is no I would love to tell you that like I'm very ecstatic about all of these companies that have lined up and said that we're going to donate something somewhere, and it's appreciated, and I'm very grateful on behalf of those who will receive said dollars or who will feel a slight bit of comfort in the moment that said company cares. But I also find that like it's like the immediate thing that I think is like business isn't really trying to save me, because their incentive structures are not aligned with that. And I think, just to kind of bring it back to the last question that Jatem asked about, you know, we folks who are graduating from business school, like I would make sure you all remember that business folks have also done some pretty dastardly things that have negatively harmed folks on the margin, right? So if it is true that they believe that Black Lives Matter or that, you know, ESG standards should be maintained, well then I would hope that we wouldn't be satisfied with statements or small scholarship programs, so on and so forth, and that we would be grateful for that and use that as the accountability mechanism to try and push for our institutions, be they business or otherwise, to be slightly more anti-racist and slightly more focused on equity and slightly more willing to transform the spaces that they have to ensure that the table might look a little different, or that the opportunity set for those who want to get into that company might look different, or the training that they might engage in might be more focused on anti-racism and equity than it would be just diversity and inclusion. So, I mean, I just want to echo all of that and remind us that a lot of the devastation that we've seen in the world has been done by the hands of those with leadership in business, with degrees that say MBA, with degrees that come from Harvard and Yale and so on and so forth, that we ascribe a lot of power to these elite recognitions of academic achievement, when in actuality, sometimes they're just reification of privilege that folks had in the first place. All I wanted to say, just to make sure and wrap this up very quickly, is that I do not trust when when institutions say to us, institutions that have not reflected these actions in the past, try and tell us that they're with us, because it might not actually be so much the case, because they're with us as long as we are beneficial for their political aspirations, their occupation of political space, and their ability to generate further and further revenue and drive up their profits. So that it's a little, again, I'm a little left of center if that hasn't been clear before. I think that, quite frankly, history is not on the side. History does enough to hold accountable these institutions that say that Black Lives Matter, because quite frankly, these institutions do not.
What a way to put a bow on this. And I hope my audio is a little bit better for you guys. Let me know in the chat box. We're going to have 2 more questions, and then we'll move to audience questions. But in this week, there was a really big press release that many of us have been talking about in reference to McKinsey. So you're speaking to an audience full of ambitious students and alumni who strive to make their mark in the world, both in the public and private sector. Many well-known companies have engaged in unethical or socially unacceptable practices. What advice would you like to give to those who remain true to their who want to remain true to their moral code, but hope to work at one of these organizations? So we'll start with Adrian, and then we'll wrap it up again with Caleb.
Yeah, this is a really tough question, right? I think if we all sat here and said, we are only ever going to work for institutions that align perfectly with our ethical and moral codes, it'd be a whole lot of unemployed folks, right? Unfortunately. And that's clearly not the answer. We'd all be like working for Iffy, right? Telling her, like asking her to tell us what we could do. But
yeah,
so I think
tell me where the money's at first, Adrian. You can't just come to me.
Well, and I think, so the trick is, I think, for people to recognize difference in degrees and difference in kind, right? There are organizations that are affirmatively bad, right? And so those may not be the organizations you want to go and work for. There are those, right, that do bad things, that have some bad practices. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us to recognize them. And then, right, and Caleb alluded to this, so much of this depends on your own economic position and being able to take care of yourself and your family and others, along with taking care of the community, right? So thinking about, how can I go into an institution, maybe like a McKinsey, right? And what is my part here in defining success for myself, right? So not only being able to get my paycheck, take care of my kids, my parents, my cousins, whatever it is, right? Donate to causes I care about. But then how can I improve this organization from the inside? Is it around anti-racist and inclusivity exercises? Is it leveraging the resources of that organization for pro bono work? Is it being the person, and unfortunately, it's still the case, right? There's so few of us, being the person at the table who's got to raise your hand and go, like maybe not on this thing, right? And pointing out where the organization may be going astray. But I think it takes all kinds, right? So some of us have to be on the outside fighting the battles and holding these institutions accountable. And some of us have to be on the inside holding these institutions accountable. And those things look differently, but they're both equally valid. And it goes back to this point, right? If we're not on the insides of these organizations, right, how can we expect them by themselves to be accountable for all the moral and ethical standards that we want them to uphold? So sometimes you just got to get in the sauce and do it. But it's up to each of us individually to decide where our level of tolerance is, right? And balance that, to be perfectly real, with our economic needs. A lot of us, especially in Black and brown communities, are taking care of a lot of people, right? Or we're disproportionately burdened with student loan debt, or we're going to be the first in our families to own homes, right? All of that. So I think it used to be the case in Black and brown communities where if you went to these big corporations and made money, right, you were a sellout. And I think I'm hopeful that people are realizing now, right, that it does take all of us inside these institutions, outside, getting our money, leveraging it, for other good means to really make change happen.
Yeah, completely agree. I think like the economic interests are just so very real, right? I think it's the fact that for, I think, disproportionately Black and brown folks, we have to think about that is emblematic of probably a much larger societal issue, right? So I think like I don't feel necessarily like senior or experienced enough to provide like meaningful advice to full ambitious students. But I do feel, I think, confident enough to say that like I would remember a few things that, humanity is capable of, as we already know, so many impressive things and so many devastating, sad things, right? We saw it in the press release that Jatem just mentioned. We saw it on, January 6th. We arguably have seen it for many, many, many years since the founding of this country and long before, right? So I would keep that in mind as you run towards institutions, right? Whether you be going to the most sincerely devoted, deeply passionate group at said civil rights or human rights organization and still experience the most virulent and nasty experiences that are so devastating towards people of color. And I think that keeping that in mind allows us to then empathize with those who are at fill in the blank private equity firm who are trying their best to represent our interests to the extent that they can, because we all walk with us on our shoulders, right? We walk into any room, for better or for worse, having to represent our communities on a pretty consistent basis. And so I think that one thing I would say is I used to view that more as some sort of burden, but I think that it's imperative that we more so accept that as a responsibility that we can link arms with people everywhere, right? With folks who are committed to this enterprise of ensuring that Black lives live better lives than they ever have lived, that we could, in fact, by doing so, kind of increase the extent and boundaries and expanse of our moral imagination, right? Become even more creative about what do anti-racist solutions look like within a private equity firm, or within a nonprofit organization, or within government, right? I think those battles need to be waged everywhere. And I think it's really incumbent upon us, especially those of us who are coming from business schools where we're really taught, at least I'm speaking on behalf of HBS, where we do cases and we don't actually sit in classes and we don't get taught things. We have the space and opportunity. We are supposedly trained to deal with a variety of problems, regardless of what sector it might be. And so what if we dedicate at least a small measure of our time to thinking carefully about how do we craft these solutions in other places? And it is, I will say one more thing, it is radically unfair that we have to be the fixers of problems we did not create, but welcome to the world in which we live, where those who are marginalized must then find their way out of the margins. So link arms with those and think creatively and collaboratively with those who are willing to engage in not just a thought experiment, but the practical daily living of what it means to be Black in corporate America, or Black in nonprofit America, or Black in living in government or working in government, or wherever you might find yourself in, and make sure you remain empathetic to those having to navigate Blackness and negotiate Blackness in all the variety of spaces within which you might inhabit, work, play, live, and experience.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I really hope people are walking away today with some serious takeaways. We have 10 minutes left, and so I'm now going to open it up for Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. We do have 3 panelists, so please be specific. Please specify if you have a question for a particular panelist or if you would like all panelists to answer. And so we'll start with Titus Potter.
Hello, everyone. I just had a quick question in regards to what policy you believe would be best serving for the Black community if we were to start right now. And I guess I would address this question to Adrian Harris, Dr. Harris. What policy do you believe would be the best start to start strengthening Black people within the policy aspect for future growth and wealth in America?
Yeah, thanks so much, Titus, for your question. I think, as we all said at the outset, it's so hard to isolate one policy that's going to unlock economic empowerment, right, social empowerment for Black people, because the way this system has been built over centuries is to layer these types of oppression on top of one another, right? So it is hard to pick just one thing that I think would be the silver bullet for our economic, social, and political empowerment. Criminal justice reform is certainly a huge one, eliminating private prisons, being thoughtful about law enforcement. If you mentioned cannabis, right? Like we could have done a whole panel on just cannabis and the irony that exists, right, in that universe as it relates to economic empowerment and criminal justice. The way we finance schools in this country, right, based on property taxes, makes zero sense and just continues, right, this awful cycle that we have around public education and keeping Black and brown people down. When we think about housing, right, and down payment assistance programs, affordable housing, and how that works, right? So unfortunately, these policies are sort of endless, and they layer on top of one another in a way that, unless you are sort of addressing them all, again, not in a race blind manner, but in a race conscious manner, you can't really pick just one. You have to sort of take as big a bite out of the apple as you can and address as many of them as you can.
We have time for about 2 or 3 more questions. Raise your hand and I'll unmute you. I do have a question while we wait for someone else. The title of this panel is Beyond the Vote, the Guide to Strengthening Blackness in Policy. Thinking of that and thinking about how powerful we've seen the Black community in terms of the presidential election, in terms of the Georgia runoff Senate election. Specifically, we just saw recently that Kamala Harris yesterday had to cast a deciding vote for COVID relief, and there were no Republicans who voted in order to support Americans. What do you think are some of the biggest takeaways for our audience? And so that question is for all. And once everyone answers that, we'll allow Jasmine Branch to come off mute and ask her question.
I'll just jump in here. I say the biggest takeaway from the 2020 elections, presidential in Georgia, is show up, right? I mean, this was not a resounding victory for Democrats. These margins, as you mentioned, right? Kamala Harris is the tiebreaker. The Senate is evenly split with the 2 Georgia seats that we got, right? More people turned out for Donald Trump in 2020 than turned out 4 years earlier. Like, that's astounding, right? So the lesson that I take from 2020, not just in the political context, but in the professional context as well, is show up. Decisions are made by those who show up.
I'd also say to that, Jatem, that show up, yes, but also realize and understand that I sit and look at those margins and I think to myself, like, all of the undoing of the health of our democracy that people had to then overcome, right? There's been so much that Brian Kemp, the governor, had done before. We sit there and laud the Secretary of State who stood up to Donald Trump in like the midnight hour, but should have been showing up himself long before then. And so I think the lesson that I took from that really was it shouldn't be that hard, right? It shouldn't be that difficult. And there are tangible things, again, back to the For the People Act, that has been introduced in the House and in the Senate, that is so critical. Like that's like it should be that much easier.
I'll just add, and as somebody who worked on judiciary on the civil rights team with voter suppression, at the same time that Michigan was going through their emergency manager situation and literally flying back and forth between DC at that time. Conyers was still alive. So if anybody knows anything about Conyers, we may have been in DC, but all things beginning in Detroit, going back and forth in Detroit, which at that time was also, facing severe things around bankruptcy, is that while this was a national election, all voting is local, right? And so a lot of this was about, while everyone focused in November last year, our team was also working with the midterms that were happening in Wisconsin and in in the South and in all these different places that often didn't get as much attention. But I do think that it's really important for us to recognize the relationship, and also to Caleb's point, the continued showing up, even in the midst of a health epidemic of our people, is quite. To be honest with you, I don't think if this was white people saving America, we would still be hearing about it, right? And it's amazing that we are not talking about how a land that wasn't created for us, and especially when we talk about Georgia, that we are talking about people who again had to show up and put their lives in harm's way to save the experiment called democracy that is still being defined. I will also say that it proved that the South is not red, the South is oppressed, right? And we have to stop calling the South a red region when the reality is we know that it is the compounding of voter suppression. It is the compounding of disenfranchisement of individuals who were formerly incarcerated. And it is also an education reality around how civics is no longer even a part of how young people come into politics at a much younger age to then participate in it when they are turning 18. So I think there's a language opportunity that has been happening that we, for those of us that have been very interested in voter suppression, we talk about this in our spaces. It's amazing to see that now being much broader and more people know about Shelby v. Holder, more people know about, the importance of the courts. People are talking about redistricting in multiple spaces. That's important. That's important because aside from elections and aside from even in between elections every 2 years, these municipal elections, these decisions that are made by Congress members, some places are actually going to be losing seats, including potentially in New York City. I'm in Brooklyn right now. Like, these are the conversations that we need to be a part of. And so while we have not overcome everything, considering that at one point in time we were considered 3/5 of a person, this isn't small.
Thank you. As a Southern girl, all I have to say is word to Andre 3000. The South got something to say. We're going to take the remaining questions. We have 2 hands raised and we have a question in the chat box. Again, please specify which panelist you would like to answer the question. And thank you all for attending today and thank you all for participating. This has been amazing. And so we're going to start with Jasmine Branch.
Hello, can you hear me? Great. Okay. First, thank you all so much. This has been great. I've truly been taking notes. You've all kind of spoken to about the fact that there are multiple routes to do this, that there isn't just one method. And this question, I guess, is specifically for Caleb, because you talked about the fact that we bring with us the Black experience and how you went from viewing it as a burden to a responsibility. So I had a question about what advice would you give to those of us who will be entering these corporate spaces of the McKinseys and the like to represent the community's best interests in a responsible manner? So to make sure that we ourselves do not have blind spots the longer we may be in these spaces.
It's a great question, Jasmine. And I don't think I'm going to have an answer that will satisfy you. In fact, it'll probably be an answer that'll frustrate you more. I think One is first taking stock of the fact that there is going to be a ceiling as to what a McKinsey or any other company will want to readily accept, right? And then it's your job to hit that ceiling as much as you possibly can and see if that ceiling's willing to then break, right? So it might mean that your consulting firm or your financial services institution might really care only about the bean count exercise associated with diversity and inclusion, right? Like, do we have enough Blacks to feel comfortable that we can say we have enough Blacks, right? Or do we have enough Black folks so we have the smiling Black person in the photo and people won't call us on it? It might be that sister or cynical. It might also be that your company is like, look, we really want to push the envelope. We want to ensure that we are having 360 reviews of how we're engaging on matters of race and identity here. Well, then you should be at the forefront of making sure that not so much that it happens, but that we are doing the utmost such that it's, you know, available to do, right? I think additionally, trying to identify, and it's sad because it's so sparse, but trying to identify senior stakeholders that might look like you, and working collaboratively with them to try and identify, you know, how can we make this place more accommodating of people who look like us, who share similar histories. But I think the first thing you should do is identify, you know, how far can we go, and then go there. In part because otherwise, you'll try and as I think I've done before, you know, erroneously, I will look at a place that I'm about to start work at, and I'll think this organization is going to be completely and totally open to really rethinking their model for hiring and cultural training, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then I'll get disappointed when none of those things happen, like ever, right? And so I think first, center on, you know, what is in fact possible, explore and expand the art of the possible, but then also ask, you know, if there are senior folks who have more privilege in that space, to put more of their privilege at stake to try and make something happen. It might not actually work, but that's why I said my answer was inherently going to be incredibly dissatisfying, because to some great extent, these institutions, be they government, be they finance, be they consulting, don't necessarily have to align with the same sort of incentives that you have to be more open. So that's my answer to you. It's super dissatisfying. It's not particularly encouraging, but I have a tendency of not necessarily writing about the most encouraging and happy things. But I think that's part of what we are kind of owed to do here in America, is to tell kind of the ugly truth. And I've chosen to tell ugly truths. So hopefully that's helpful, but I assume that it's not satisfying.
Thank you. We do have a question in the chat box from our outgoing BBSA President Donald Lindsay. I would ask that one panelist answer this, whoever feels most called to answer. As MBA students, our education tends to be one-dimensional as in it pertains to policy. How can we push for better education, and what resources that we can leverage to enhance our learning outside of being a dual degree like Jatim?
Maybe as the Michigan professor, I'll dive in here. So I would say, you know, one of the courses I took in business school after I'd been to law school was a business and policy class. Now it, you know, like a lot of classes, gives you lots of theory and frameworks, and that are quite different from putting those things into action once you're out of school. But I would certainly push for some of that curriculum at Ross, right? In addition, you don't have to be a joint degree like Jatem, or, you know, like I was, or, you know, Caleb has. Like, I think we all have more than one advanced degree, whether we did them together or not. But you can still cross-register, right, and take courses at the policy school or at the law school. So I would take advantage, especially at a school like Michigan, where all the schools are top 10, you know, in their areas. Like, I would definitely take advantage of that. And then, you know, there's just no time like the present in the 21st century. Your ability to find information and find resources to educate yourself is unparalleled. So even if there isn't a class being offered, right, you have Coursera and, right, like endless platforms where you can go and find educational resources for yourselves if you're interested in policy, but, you know, you're in the business school.
Thank you so much. I wish I could unmute everyone to give the panelists a round of applause, but I think you gave the people what they needed on this first Saturday in Black History Month. Panelists, thank you so much for volunteering and being able to spread this word with us. I just want to let everyone know there will be a 15-minute break, and then meet us back here on Passable for Reclaiming Black Influence with Marcus Collins, who's our very, very close connection to Beyonce. So we'll call him our Beyonce. Again, thank you all so much. And on your way out, please leave some love in the chat box.